So, welcome to this episode of Crap No One Tells You. With me today is Chris Williams, and he has a website called CSWill.com, which I absolutely recommend you check out. So, Chris, welcome.
Hi, it's CLWill.com, but that's
Oh,
okay.
I'm
Uh,
sorry. I'm now we got it in. Definitely got it in this time.
okay, that
so,
works. That works.
what is we're just gonna dive right in. So, what is some crap no one tells you about corporate leadership?
Well, my favorite thing to tell people about corporate leadership that they don't understand is that every one of those people you look up to, whether it's Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or even Joe Biden or everybody who is in leadership is just as nervous and scared and self-doubting and unsure of whether or not they're doing the right thing as everybody you've ever met. They are all just human beings who are as concerned about what you think about them and as concerned about getting the right things done as anybody else. And they put on a great face. In fact, that's why one of the reasons they've gotten where they've gotten, because they've gotten very good at putting on a face of self-assuredness and confidence and belief in what they're trying to do and where they're trying to go. And we're all headed in the same direction and everything. But when you peek under the covers and you talk to them over a beer or you get them alone in a room, you can find out that they are just as nervous and scared and not self-assured and am I doing the right thing as everybody else is.
Right. And yeah, I always remember my old boss took me out for I think it was like my 24th birthday. And we were at a franchisor convention in England. And there were a bunch of these like franchise executives and these leadership teams. And he decided to invite a few of them to my birthday. And I got all nervous because basically I'm sitting at my birthday table with all of these guys in like super high level positions. Most of them were like multimillionaires. And here I am, this 24-year-old snot-nosed kid, know nothing about the world at the time. And I'm like, oh, like, how am I supposed to talk to these guys? And what I found out, we went to this laid back Indian restaurant in the middle of London. And the primary conversation with one of the guys during my entire birthday dinner was about the movie with Adam Sandler, the golf movie. And it
Yeah.
was one of those moments where I was like, oh my God, like they are not on a different planet. Like they watch the same stuff I do. They find the same stuff funny that I do. Like you can have a conversation with them. It's not they're people just like you. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of times people kind of forget that.
Right. I have had I have met with people at all levels, all over the Fortune 500, all around the world. I've been very, very fortunate. When I was VP of Human Resources at Microsoft, one of the things I was responsible for was putting on Bill Gates's famous CEO summit, where he brought in CEOs from around the world.
Hmm.
That was an absolute blast, particularly for someone like me, because I got an opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with just a stunning array of people. I've had one-on-one conversations with people like Arthur Blank, who was Home Depot, and Michael Eisner of Disney. I had a huge, long conversation with Martha Stewart, which was absolutely strange and unusual. I've had these incredible conversations. I've had these incredible conversations with people. I've traveled the world. I met Sir John Brown of Shell Oil. I've had one-on-one conversations with Jack Welch of GE. I've met just countless people, and at the top of those companies, in the middle of those companies, in the C-suite for large corporations, and virtually every single one of them. I mean, I work very closely with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. I consider Bill a friend. I know those people intimately, and I can tell you that when the lights are off and when they're in their office and you're talking about some issue, they are just as concerned and nervous about how things are going to get done Are they headed in the right direction, and are people saying silly things about them, and all those things are the same things that you and I worry about. And yes, they laugh at the same jokes, and some of them are different, but most of them are the same jokes and that sort of thing.
Right. At
What
the
has
end of the day,
happened
they're
is
people.
Right. And what has happened is they have learned over time that in order to be a leader, you need to put on a face to the team that is strong and unwavering and has a clear direction. Because if you are weak and vulnerable and tenuous and nervous, nobody has a reason to want to follow you. So they have learned what part of what leadership is setting a clear direction and consistently mentioning and heading in that direction. Now, to be fair, there are a very, very small number of them, a really small number, like you could count them on one hand, who are malignant narcissists who honestly believe their own PR and are, in their own little world. um, and I think if you think about it, you can probably think of one or two of them who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to name them. But most of them are just regular human beings who are just trying to do a job. And over the years, they've learned how to put on this face, this shell that is of a strong and unwavering person. What that works though for most people's advantage, which is one of the things that's really cool about it, is if you recognize that, you can use it to your advantage. So if you're working for someone and they are someone who is a somewhat threatening person, or at least a behind a wall, one of the things you can do is you can look up at that person and try and figure out what it is that are those things that are keeping them awake at night. What are the things that they worry about, that they're nervous about,
Yeah.
that they aren't concerned about, and see if you can find a way to help them. And if you can, for example, if they're worried about how this part of this project is going to get done, if you can go into them and say, don't worry about it, I got this, I'm going to handle it, you will look like a hero to them. You will be somebody who is helpful. The thing is, almost all of them also realize that they can't do this alone, right? They need a team of people around them who can help them do stuff. So having people around them like you who can help them get stuff done is good for them, makes them look better, and it makes you look useful and helpful. And that's the way, one of the best ways to get promoted or to get a raise, or is to look up at your boss, figure out what it is that's keeping them awake at night, that is making them nervous, that is making them feel scared, and help them get that thing solved. And if you do that, you look like a hero.
Right. So let me ask you another question, because it's kind of on that subject line. So we have good leaders and we have great leaders, right? And it's like, I don't know if you play golf or ever done any sport, but the difference between good and great is subtle yet astronomical,
Yep. And
right? So
it's in
what do you think are some of the elements in leadership?
Well, it's in every field. I spent many years writing software, and in the software field, they refer to those people as the 10x developer. In other words, someone who can write 10 times more code or do 10 times a better job than anybody else. And those people are people who have gone from good to great. And in the leadership world, the difference between good and great is somewhat of a subtle one, but it's once you see it, it's really obvious. And that is that they are people who can not only get people to move in the same direction, but inspire people to move in the same direction. In other words, they can reach down to an individual person and say, I understand what is driving you, and I'm headed in the same direction, and we both need to head in that same direction. So there's a level of empathy there that isn't very common, and that's what tends to make a great leader. There's also a level of clarity of vision. In other words, they know exactly where they want to go. There's very little um, um, wavering in the direction that they want to head in. So they can point to the future and say, "This is where I want to go," and then they can use empathy and inspiration to get people to head in that same direction. And if you look around at all the people who you think of who are really good, great leaders, you will realize that they are people who many people can relate to. They are often very warm people. They are people who you can who you might want to, as they say, have a beer with, right? Someone like that,
Hmm.
but who also has a very clear perspective of where they want to go. They are very driven and clear about the direction that they want to head in. There's not a lot of, well, I don't know, and I'm not sure, and what do
Yeah.
you think? And
Yes. Yeah.
it
Maybe over here, maybe this, right?
right,
No,
right.
they 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 know they make a decision, they tell you, which is also why they can bring you on board easily.
Right. The other thing that is universally true of, actually, you really can't make it much beyond the director level into the VP levels in any significant corporation without being an outstanding communicator. You've got to be able to say what you're trying to say extremely clearly, and in a way that everybody can hear it. um, that's one of the things that, if you look at people who are really good, I mean, it's true in politics, it's true in everything else. The people who can
Mhm.
state a case very clearly with a clear, crisp direction of where they want to go are the people want to follow. um, and the difference between, there are many good leaders who are sort of command and control kinds of people, right? Damn it, this is the direction we're going to go in, and you're going to follow me because you got to follow me. Those people don't usually last very long and do not get a lot of loyalty or a lot of people being inspired by them. The people who can look further in the organization and win hearts and minds, as they say, are the people who rise from being good managers to being great managers and great leaders.
That's actually very, you're making me think a lot as we're talking, which is I appreciate. But yeah, one of the things that you mentioned there is the empathy factor. And I think that is one of the most undervalued leadership skills that is out there, because a lot of people mistake, I think, empathy for sympathy, and empathy for a way of making up excuses for people sometimes, right? Because you're trying to relate, you're trying to understand. So a lot of times as leaders, we give people that benefit of the doubt because of the empathy factor. Um, but I was listening to someone the other day, and it reminds me of another thing you said. Was someone, it may have even been one of your videos, to be honest with you, is that Oprah, I believe it was Oprah, always walks into meetings and the first thing out of her mouth is, "What is this meeting about? What are we looking to accomplish?" And it was one of those things that just in my brain, I went, "Oh my God, it's getting to the point immediately, setting the standard, setting the, this is what we're doing here. We're going to do it as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, without offending anyone in the process. Chit chat belongs in an organization, it belongs as a manager. But during meetings and other things like that, you want to keep that conciseness, right?"
Right.
And
You raised two very good points, and I think, doing meetings well is a learned skill, and there are not a lot of people who are really good at it. I've talked to leaders all the time about it. Doing a meeting well is actually not that hard. It just requires discipline that most leaders don't have, which is, as you just said, you've got to have a focus on what you're trying to accomplish. You got to make sure that sidetrack doesn't happen. You got to make sure that you're maximizing the amount of value you're getting out of the people in the room. Because one of the things I encourage leaders to do when they look around a meeting is to quickly in their head count up how many dollars per minute it's costing them to be sitting there in that room. And pretty soon you suddenly start to realize, oh my God, I better talk really fast or get something done, because if I don't, because pretty soon the dollars per minute goes through the roof. But meetings is
Right.
one thing. But going back to your point about empathy, I think that's one of the things that I try and work with people on all the time. I think one of the things many leaders don't realize is you can be a strong leader with a clear, crisp vision of where you want the organization to go and still have empathy. And in fact, empathy, if you look to some of the best leaders, they are often some of the most empathetic. And here's the reason why. Every single person is unique. I think we all know that, right? Every single person is unique as a snowflake, as they say. And one of the things that if you want to be a good leader and manager, one of the things you have to do is make sure that you're paying attention to each of the people and how they need to get talked to. So, for example, let's say you've got somebody who is having a performance problem, right? Or they're not getting something done the way you want it to get done. If you go in, there are some people who've been in the business forever and they're old hats and crusty veterans. And those people you want to go into and say, look, this is what we need to get done. This is what you did. This is the difference. Can we please get this done the right way? But if you go to someone who's brand new and just trying to figure it out, and you go into them with that hardcore, actual, strict, lay it on the line kind of conversation, you will melt them, right? Oh my God, I didn't know I was supposed to do that, and I'm really sorry. And so you have to pay attention to each individual. And some people prefer what they used to call the S sandwich, right? The sandwich of you give somebody, oh, you're doing a good job, but there's this one thing you're not quite doing right, but don't worry, you're still doing a good job.
Right.
That sandwich technique, there are some people who absolutely need that, right? They are scared and nervous and vulnerable about what they're doing. So they need to be able to do that. On the other hand, there are other people who are, sorry, my I just got a message from the software telling
It's
me
all
we
good.
needed to record something. There are other people, however, there are other people who absolutely need hard, and they would laugh when you start to give them the sandwich. So one of the more important factors that leaders need to consider is who needs to hear what and how they need to hear it. And that relies on a sense of empathy. You have to be able to talk to each one of the people you're working with and send them the message they need to send. Again, this is one place where politicians can frequently excel, but all good leaders will be able to do that. They will know their audience, know who they're talking to, and gear the message to the people who need to hear it and in the way they need to hear it. And again, this just goes back to this whole empathy thing. I am able to put myself in your shoes and hear what you want to hear and hear what's important to you, and position. We got to make a huge change in the company. We're going to change this to do that. Well, very often I need to explain to you why, but not only why we need to do that, but in the terms that you can understand what this means for you, right? And that's this level of empathy that you're talking about.
Right.
So the very best, again, you're absolutely right. That's the difference between good and great, is this understanding and ability to show some empathy.
Yeah. So I'm actually gonna jump to something now, just because
Please.
we've chatted a little bit, and I have an understanding of where you came from and how you got to where you are. So I want to transition a little bit into how to build efficient teams.
Okay.
But before we get into the details of that, how did you get to where you are today? Because you've gone through the process from working to team building to lead, like you've been through the entire gambit, right?
Yep. And I have been fascinated with how teams are built and how leadership is done since I was about 17 years old. And my very first job was I I was installing car stereos, and the head of the chain, I worked for a chain of companies that installed car stereos. And the head of the chain came to me one day and said, "Hey, see Jeremy over there? He needs to get fired. Go fire him." And I said, "How come the manager of the store isn't firing him?" And he said, "You've got the gift of gab. You go over and fire him." And I was like 17, 18 years old. And I went over and said, "Hey, Jeremy, it's not working out. You need to go." And I learned very early on that leadership and organizational skills were important. And from there, I went on.
Yes.
I got a degree in computer science. I loved computers, so I wrote software for a living. But one of the things you find out when you're writing software is it's a team effort, right? Very early on, you
Oh,
start
yeah.
to realize no one human being can write all that stuff. And I got good at understanding how
No.
teams work together and how they work. Then the company I worked for, a company, five of us, myself and five other people, wrote a product called Fox Pro, which was a database package, and it was bought by Microsoft. And I came to Microsoft like a kid in a candy store because there were so many opportunities. And I rose in Microsoft time and time again, taking on bigger and bigger and bigger organizations. And eventually got to the point where I was leading a team that had gone from myself and my assistant to a team of over 500 people in less than a year. And we shipped a product called Microsoft Visual Studio that in its first year sold $100
I
million
still remember
worth
that.
of products, right? So
Yep.
the team I built from scratch created Microsoft Visual Studio, pulled together 6 different products into a single thing, and it sold $100 million in its first year. And I was about to get out of that, retire from Microsoft because my work here is done. I've done a huge thing, and my HR person came to me and said, "You should be in HR." And I said, "You should be committed." I mean, what kind of a human being would go into HR for? And she said, "No, you understand how teams are built, an organization, and you should do this." And so I went into HR. I absolutely had a blast. It was fun being the translator. I don't know if you remember, Damon Wayans used to do this thing where he was Obama's anger translator, right? And I ended up where he
I forgot about those.
right?
Yes.
Well, so I ended up being HR's technical translator. So the
Mhm.
people in the technical side of the company would come to HR with these questions, and HR would go, "I don't even understand what they're talking about," and I would say,
Right.
don't worry about it. We'll be fine. Here's what they really mean." Or I would go to the technical teams and say, "Yeah, HR is using all kinds of funny words, but what they really mean is this," right? So
Right.
I enjoyed that job immensely. And then one day my boss came in and said, "You said you always wanted to have my job." And I said, "Well, yeah, everybody says that when they're interviewing for a job. One day I'd like your job." He said, "Well, how about Thursday?" And I suddenly became vice president of human resources for 32,000 employees in 160 locations around the world, working for Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer.
On Thursday.
Yeah, on Thursday.
Right,
It
on
was
Thursday.
Tuesday, and 2 days later, I was VP of HR for this enormous corporation. It was an
Wow, that's
absolute blast. I had one of the things I did was I changed the compensation, benefits, salary, stock level for every single one of 32,000 employees, and we did it all on the same day. And it changed
wow.
absolutely everything about everybody's compensation package on the same day. And we did it so effectively that I got one negative email. It worked beautifully. And
That's
so when I
that's
finished that,
amazing. Like,
that's when I said, "Okay, my work here is done." And since that point,
now I'm done. Okay.
I've been consulting and coaching and working with people on how to be better leaders. And that's what I do today is help people be better leaders.
Okay. So how how do you or what do you think if, let's say, you have a smaller entity or a smaller business? They might be at the 10 to 15 employee level, right? Which is right around that break point where you start needing what I call like middle management. Like you need someone below, you need a level of management, which means you now have to start worrying about putting together, because your first team is just you and the team, right? And it's relatively easy because you're responsible. But the moment you need to add that layer in between is when things start getting tricky. Well, I
Yep.
think that's where it starts getting tricky.
I've said this 1,000 different times. The moving from an individual contributor to being a manager, that's a difficult change, right? You have to understand that you can't do
Hmm.
everything yourself, and you need to figure out how to motivate people to do better, and you need to figure out that change from individual contributor to being a manager. It's a very different job, and it's hard to do, but it isn't even in the same neighborhood as the complexity of the next jump, which is to be a
Right.
manager of managers. Because at that point,
Yes.
everything is by remote control. When you're a manager of a team, if somebody's not doing something right, you can go in and, hey, okay, let me help you figure this out, and I'll make it, you and I can make it work together, or you can even micromanage and whatever, solve the problem.
Hmm.
But when you're a manager of managers, you can't do that. You have to operate through other people. You have to make sure that your messages are clear, that the objectives are clear. So when you used to be able to be hands-on, you now have to work through people to get things done. And that manager of managers transition is really, really hard. It's the hardest transition you will ever make. Once you go above that, it's just scaling that, right? It's larger and larger and
Right.
larger. But that first time, you have to figure out, how do I motivate people to get things done without actually getting my hands into doing the thing? That's really hard.
Yes.
And that involves all those
It's
skills we were talking about before. That involves the empathy, the persuasion, the clear vision, the
Mhm.
direction setting, the consistent communication. That's when you have to learn those things. That, in fact, is where the wheels fall off the bus for most people. When you talk about my manager is a bad manager, you're rarely talking about the line supervisor who's the bad manager. The bad
right.
manager is the one above them who is unable to make that transition into that role that I was just talking about, where you have to do everything by remote control and by influence and by motivation and by communication. That's where that's the home of bad managers. And the biggest problem is that most companies don't teach people how to do that. They're very good at teaching people how to be a line supervisor. All of them do a manager 101. Almost none of them do a manager 301, right? And that's where it really is most
Right.
important.
Yeah, I sometimes use the analogy of remember the kids game, what's it called? Pass it down the lane, where you whisper something into someone's ear and then they have to whisper it to the next
Yep.
person and so on and so forth.
Yep.
I always use the, if you are a great leader, what you whisper to the first person is simple and clear enough that they can pass it down,
Yep.
right? If you come up with a 300 word soup and expect someone to pass that effectively down the lane, it's just not gonna happen, right?
It
Like
never does.
I don't
Exactly.
care how great, right. So
The
I
other
think
the
that is like one of the things that gets lost from vision and messaging at like a very, very senior level to down. And this comes back down to the clarity of messaging you were talking about.
Yep.
Is that the clearer that message is, the easier it is for everybody down the line to kind of follow along.
There's also, yes, that absolutely, that's essential, right? You have to have a clear, crisp message. But here's another one that's also equally as important, in a place where many, many managers and leaders don't understand. And that is, you have to repeat that message over and over and over and over and
Hmm.
consistently stay on message, right? And the problem is, most senior leaders that I work with, what happens to them is they will say, but I've said this 10 different times. I'm tired of talking about it. I've said it 10 times. And I'll point out to them that, yes, you said that 10 times to 10 different groups of people. So each one of those people has
Right.
heard it precisely once. And for something to sink in, they need to hear it 3 times, 5 times, 8 times. So what that means
Yep.
is you can't just say it 10 times. You have to say it 80 times. The other thing you have to
Yep.
do is you have to remember that you can't say it and get tired of it. And a week from Thursday, you're going to have a different one because it takes
Hmm.
time for that to echo all the way down. It takes time to execute whatever that last vision was. So you cannot distract
Yep.
people with the latest thing that is interesting to you. You can't distract them with, oh, by the way, there's something over here we need to work on. You have to give a clear
Yes.
message, you have to repeat a clear message, and you have to stay on a clear message, which is again one of those elements of communication that many senior leaders who are good but not great fall down on. They don't remember that it's got to be
Yeah.
clear, frequent, and consistent.
Yeah, I tell my managers all the time is I would rather get the eye roll from you because I've told you this 10 times than having missed telling you. Like,
Yep.
give me the eye roll any day of the week because it means you already know what I'm about to say, which is far more important than not having heard it ever.
Well, and if you do get the eye roll, what that means is, so if someone comes to you and says, "Should I do X or should I do Y?" and you say, "But hey, remember this is what we're trying to do, so obviously we're going
Mhm.
to do X." And if you do that consistently over and over and over again, pretty soon that person will not come to you asking you, should I do X or should I do Y? Because it will be obvious what your answer will be. So they'll just go ahead and do X. And what did I just describe? I described delegation.
Mhm.
I described pushing the responsibility down into the organization. And most of what that means, most of what delegation is, most of what pushing responsibility down into an organization is clarity of communication, clarity of vision, clarity of what you're trying to accomplish. So you're right, repeating it time and time. I'd much rather have an eye roll because an eye roll means you probably shouldn't have brought me this question in the first place. You should have
Yep.
known to do it yourself.
Exactly. Yes. Yep. And it's funny because I remember one of the times I went on vacation and we were going through a bunch of changes and there was some turmoil going on, but I had to leave for a week. And apparently, three of my staff members decided to put together a committee called WWGD, and they would meet once a day for 15 minutes. And the committee was, what would Gummy do? And they said,
Yep.
anything we had questions about, the three of us would sit down. If two of us agreed that that's what you would do, that's what we would go with, because it meant it was probably had been said multiple times over. And I'm like, that is the most fantastic thing I've heard as a leader, is because it means if I missed one of you, the other two filled in with whatever I might have missed.
Yep.
And it was one of
It
those
also
moments where I
means
realized we had kind of bred that right culture.
Right. It also means that you have laid out a set of vision and principles of where things need to go so that it's in many ways implicit and nobody really needs to guess at what it is. I mean, the question
Mhm.
WWGD, you'd almost even rather that didn't happen, right? You'd almost rather they just
Right.
assumed they knew what GD, right? They knew
Yes.
what Gummy would do.
Yes.
And they didn't even have to
A
ask, right? It just was, yes, I know,
correct.
I know. I'm so tired of Gummy telling me this. I'm just going to go do it, right? And that's
Yes.
the kind of communication that works, right?
Yeah, and like I said, it was because we had a lot of turmoil going on that nowadays it just functions like it's supposed to, but I just thought it was awesome that even
I
during a
agree.
time of turmoil, they still figured it out. Like,
Yep.
I didn't get a phone call the entire week I was gone,
Yep.
and I was
Exactly.
fully set. I had warned my wife, like, "They're probably gonna be calling. They're not a peep for a week."
and
So,
and that's one of the that's another metric I ask leaders to use, which is if you are not present and you get no phone calls, that's not a bad thing, right? That's a good thing. That means the organization
yeah,
is running without your needing to be right there on top of them all the time.
yep. So, so to kind of wrap this up, if you had one piece of advice to someone that's stepping into a leadership role, what would that be?
The first thing nearly everybody should do when they step into a new leadership role is to spend a lot of time listening. Because no matter what happens, no matter how or why you got the leadership role, you didn't know all that you needed to know in order to take over that role. Even if you were promoted from within the team to manage that group, you didn't have everybody's perspective on what was wrong. You might have been sitting there for months thinking, man, if I ever lead this team, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And that's the last thing you should do. The first thing you should do is talk to everybody and listen a lot to understand what really is going on. And likely you will get confirmation that, yep, everybody agrees with you. And those are the things that need to get worked on. But more often than not, you'll also hear some stuff you didn't know, or you'll hear the objections of other people so that you know how to deal with those in the future, or you'll hear things that are going well that you didn't even think were going well, right? So the first thing I tell people when they get any kind of a new role, particularly a new management role, is you need to spend a bunch of time listening.
Yeah, ask questions, right?
Yep. And shut up,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah,
hard for
well,
me.
yeah, that's the hard part for many. So, but thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time. And I am sure we will bring you back at some point because based on your background, I have a feeling we could probably cover 10 different topics.
I love it.
So
This
thanks
was
everyone
fun.
for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. So thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. And we will be back with another episode.